On the morning of September 14th, 2021, a 58-year-old farmer named Dale Harmon was sitting in the cab of his John Deere 8370R in the middle of his cornfield outside Oskaloosa, Iowa, watching the harvest monitor display numbers that represented 11 months of work, 11 months of early mornings and late nights and weather anxiety and input costs, and the particular sustained hope that keeps a farmer moving through every difficulty the season presents. And the combine was running clean and the yield was coming in stronger than his September estimate, and the morning light was hitting the harvested rows behind him in that specific way it hits in the Iowa fall, golden and low and final, the light that tells a farmer the season is closing and the work has been worth it. And Dale Harmon had his hand on the header controls and his eyes on the standing corn ahead of him, and was experiencing the specific satisfaction of a man whose gamble with soil and seed and weather has come in on the right side. And then the display in front of him changed, and the combine slowed, and a message appeared on the screen that Dale read once and then read again, because the first reading had not produced understanding, only confusion. And the message said that his machine had been flagged for unauthorized modification, and that remote operational restrictions had been applied pending review by an authorized John Deere service representative. And the combine stopped, completely and finally stopped, in the middle of his field, in the middle of his harvest, on a morning when the weather was perfect and the yield was strong, and there was not a single reason in the physical world for the machine to be anything other than running. Dale sat in that cab for a long time without moving, looking at the message on the screen, looking at the standing corn ahead of him that the combine was no longer moving toward, looking at the harvested rows behind him that represented what the morning had produced before the screen changed. And the silence in the cab had a quality that anyone who has ever sat in stopped machinery in the middle of work that cannot be stopped will recognize immediately. The silence of a situation that does not make sense yet and is going to make less sense the longer it continues. And then Dale picked up his phone and called the authorized John Deere dealer in Ottawa, 40 minutes away, and explained what the screen said. And the service representative who answered told him that yes, the system had flagged his machine, that there was a record of non-authorized software modification on his 8370R, and that the restriction would remain in place until an authorized technician could inspect the machine and clear the flag. And Dale said, "When can a technician come out?" And the representative said, "We have availability in about 12 to 14 days. And Dale said, "I have 400 acres of standing corn at a 7-day weather window." And the representative said, "I understand that's difficult, Mr. Harmon, but our schedule is what it is." And Dale said, "My crop is going to be worth $40,000 less in 14 days if it sits in the field unharvested." And the representative said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Harmon, there's nothing I can do about the schedule." And Dale sat in his stopped combine in his Iowa cornfield and understood with the particular clarity that arrives in moments of complete stillness that the machine he had paid $380,000 for 3 years ago and had maintained carefully and had relied on for 3 harvest seasons was no longer fully his, had not been fully his since the moment he signed the purchase agreement that included the software licensing terms he had read incompletely and understood partially and accepted entirely because there was no alternative if you wanted the machine, and that the company that had sold him that machine for $380,000 had just used the software embedded in it to stop his harvest from 40 miles away without his consent and without physical justification, and with a remedy timeline that would cost him more than most people's annual salary. What had triggered the lockout was a repair Dale had made 6 weeks earlier in late July, a repair to the combine sensor array that had been throwing fault codes since June and that the authorized dealer had been unable to schedule for 8 weeks. 8 weeks during which Dale had called 3 times and been told each time that the next available appointment was further out than the last. And Dale had finally driven to an independent repair shop in Knoxville run by a man named Frank Gallo, who had been working on farm equipment for 30 years and who had diagnosed the sensor fault in 40 minutes and repaired it in 2 hours for $340, compared to the authorized dealer's estimate of $1,200 and an 8-week wait. And the repair had worked perfectly, the fault codes had cleared, and the combine had run without issue through the remaining weeks before harvest, and Dale had considered the matter resolved until the morning of September 14th, when the display changed and the machine stopped, and 12 to 14 days became the answer to a question that his crop could not afford to wait on. He climbed down from the cab and stood in the field beside his stopped combine, $380,000 of green and yellow iron sitting silent in the Iowa morning, and he looked at the standing corn ahead of it and the harvested rows behind it and the sky above it that was clear and would stay clear for maybe 7 more days before the forecast changed. And he took out his phone, and he did something that he had not planned to do and had not considered doing until he was standing in that field looking at that stopped machine, which was to open his camera and start recording, not dramatically, not with anger in his voice, just steadily and honestly, the way a man speaks when he is describing something that happened and wants the description to be accurate. And he pointed the camera at the combine and at the field and at the message still visible on the cab display, and he explained what had occurred in plain and specific language: the sensor repair and the independent shop and the $340 and the 8-week dealer wait and the lockout message and the 14-day service timeline and the $40,000 his standing corn would lose if the weather turned before the combine moved again. And when he finished, he looked at the camera for a moment and said, "I paid $380,000 for this machine, and I cannot use it on my own land." And then he stopped recording and looked at the file on his phone and posted it to a farming community Facebook group he had belonged to for 4 years, and put his phone in his pocket and stood in his field and waited, not knowing what he was waiting for, just knowing that standing still in the middle of something this wrong was the one thing he could not do. The video had 400 views when Dale walked back to his farmhouse at noon, and it had 4,000 views by the time he sat down for lunch, and it had 40,000 views by 3 in the afternoon when his phone started ringing with numbers he didn't recognize. And Dale looked at his phone and looked at the 40,000 views and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not satisfaction and not vindication, but a quiet unease. The unease of a private man who has said a private thing in a public place and is only now understanding how public the place actually is. Because Dale Harmon was not a man who sought attention, had never posted anything on social media that was designed to generate a reaction, had used the farming community Facebook group for 4 years to share planting updates and weather observations and the occasional photograph of a good yield. And the video he had posted from his cornfield that morning had been an act of honest documentation rather than a calculated appeal. And the difference between those two things was becoming less clear with every passing hour, as the views climbed and the comments accumulated and the phone rang with numbers from area codes he had never seen. The comments on the video were doing something that Dale had not anticipated, which was organizing themselves. Not chaotically the way internet comments usually organize, a noise of opinions and reactions and arguments going nowhere, but purposefully. Farmers talking to other farmers in the specific shorthand of people who share a common situation and recognize it immediately when they see it described accurately. Comments that said, "This happened to me last spring and I lost 2 weeks of planting." Comments that said, "My dealer told me 6 weeks for a hydraulic repair during corn planting and I had to borrow a neighbor's machine just to get in the field." Comments that said, "I have a $420,000 tractor sitting in my shed right now waiting on an authorized technician who can't come for 3 weeks." And underneath the specific complaints was a shared understanding that what Dale had described was not an isolated incident, but a pattern. A system that had been designed to route all repair work through authorized channels regardless of the farmer's circumstances or the urgency of his situation, and that the remote lockout capability embedded in John Deere's equipment was the enforcement mechanism for that system, the thing that turned a policy preference into an operational reality that a farmer sitting in a stopped combine in the middle of harvest could not argue with or work around or fix with a phone call to a man in Knoxville who charged $340 instead of $1,200. By 6 in the evening, the video had 180,000 views, and a man named Curtis Webb from outside Des Moines had posted in the comments that he was driving his tractor to John Deere's regional office in Moline, Illinois on Friday morning, and that anyone who wanted to join him was welcome. And the comment had 340 likes in the first hour, and the replies beneath it were farmers saying, "I'll be there, and what time, and how do we coordinate?" And Dale read that comment and the replies beneath it sitting at his kitchen table and felt the unease deepen, because the thing he had started with a 7-minute video posted from a cornfield was becoming something larger and more organized than he had intended or imagined, and he was not sure whether larger and more organized was the right direction, or whether it would help his combine get unlocked, or whether it would instead harden John Deere's position and produce a legal response that a small Iowa farmer was not equipped to handle. He called his neighbor Tom Briggs, who farmed 600 acres adjacent to Dale's south fence line, and who had the particular combination of practical judgment and calm temperament that Dale had relied on for 20 years when a situation required a perspective other than his own. And Tom came over and sat at the kitchen table and watched the video and scrolled through the comments and looked at the 180,000 views and said, "Dale, this is not a small thing anymore." And Dale said, "I know." And Tom said, "You need to decide what you want from it." And Dale said, "I want my combine unlocked." And Tom said, "You're going to get more than that whether you want it or not." And Dale said, "What do you mean?" And Tom said, "There are farmers in 7 states talking about driving to Moline on Friday. This is not about your combine anymore. This is about every farmer who has ever sat in a stopped machine waiting on an authorized technician while his crop was standing in the field." And Dale looked at his phone and then looked out the window at his darkened cornfield and said, "I just wanted to harvest my corn." And Tom said, "I know you did." And then Tom said something that Dale would think about many times in the weeks that followed. He said, "Dale, you documented everything, didn't you?" And Dale said, "What do you mean?" And Tom said, "The dealer calls, the repair quotes, the wait times, the Frank Gallo invoice, all of it." And Dale said, "I keep records of everything, always have. My father taught me that a farmer who doesn't document his business is a farmer who loses arguments he should win." And Tom nodded slowly and said, "Then you're not as exposed as you think you are." And Dale said, "What do you mean, exposed?" And Tom said, "John Deere has lawyers, and you have a Facebook video. That's the exposure I mean. But if you have 3 years of documented interactions showing a pattern of unreasonable wait times and excessive repair costs and service delays during critical planting and harvest windows, that documentation is not just protection, it is the reason why what happens Friday is going to matter beyond Friday." And Dale got up from the kitchen table and went to the filing cabinet in the corner of the room and opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila folder that was 2 inches thick with printed emails and service invoices and dealer call logs and repair estimates. 3 years of interactions with John Deere's authorized service system, recorded with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had learned from his father that the details you write down are the only details that survive a dispute. And he set the folder on the kitchen table between them, and Tom looked at it and said, "That's your combine back." And Dale looked at the folder and the phone showing 200,000 views and the darkened cornfield outside the window, and understood for the first time since the display changed that morning that the stopped combine in his field was not the end of something, but the beginning of it. Friday morning arrived with the particular cold clarity of an Iowa September that has decided to remind everyone that October is close. And Dale was up at 4:30, not because the alarm told him to be, but because sleep had become unavailable sometime around 2 in the morning when his phone had finally stopped generating enough notifications to light the bedroom ceiling. And he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder in front of him and his phone beside it, and looked at the view count on the video, which had crossed 800,000 sometime during the night and had comments still arriving faster than he could read them. And he was trying to hold in his mind simultaneously the thing he had been for 58 years, which was a farmer in Oskaloosa, Iowa, with 400 acres of standing corn and a stopped combine, and the thing he appeared to have become in the past 48 hours, which was the public face of argument that several 100,000 people had decided they had a personal stake in. And the distance between those two things was wider than any distance Dale Harmon had navigated before, and he was navigating it alone at 4:30 in the morning with coffee that was still too hot to drink and a folder of documents that Tom Briggs had told him was his combine back. The convoy had organized itself with the spontaneous efficiency that angry people with a common purpose sometimes produce, and by Thursday evening there were confirmed participants from Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Missouri. Farmers who had loaded their tractors onto flatbeds or who intended to drive them the final miles to John Deere's regional office in Moline under their own power. And the logistics had been coordinated entirely through Facebook comments and a group chat that Curtis Webb had created on Wednesday night and that had 340 members by Thursday morning and 890 members by Thursday evening. And the plan was simple in the way that plans are simple when the people making them have a clear objective and no interest in complexity, which was to arrive at John Deere's regional office on East Moline Boulevard at 9 in the morning on Friday, September 17th and park. Just park, in silent rows, engines off, no shouting, no signs beyond a few handwritten ones that farmers had made themselves, just the physical presence of 63 pieces of John Deere equipment sitting outside the building that represented the company that had stopped Dale Harmon's harvest from 40 miles away on a clear September morning when the corn was ready and the weather was good and there was no mechanical reason for the machine to be anything other than running. Dale drove to Moline on Thursday evening, not in a tractor but in his truck, Tom Briggs riding in the passenger seat with the manila folder on his lap and a quiet expression on his face that communicated the specific combination of support and concern that a good neighbor produces when he has agreed to accompany a friend into a situation that neither of them fully understands. And they checked into a motel 6 miles from John Deere's regional office, and Dale sat on the edge of the bed and called his daughter Rachel in Des Moines, who had been texting him since Wednesday afternoon with a mixture of maternal concern and practical advice that reminded him painfully of her mother. And Rachel said, "Dad, do you have a lawyer?" And Dale said, "I have Tom." And Rachel said, "Tom is a corn farmer, Dad. You need an actual lawyer." And Dale said, "Rachel, I have a folder of documents and 63 tractors. I think I'm all right." And Rachel said, "Please don't say anything to anyone tomorrow that you haven't thought about completely." And Dale said, "I'm planning to say nothing at all." And Rachel said, "That might actually be the right answer." And Dale said goodnight and put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought about the combine sitting in his field and the standing corn around it and the weather forecast that was giving him 4 more days before the system moved in from the northwest, 4 days that the authorized service timeline would not satisfy and that 63 tractors parked outside a building in Moline might or might not change. And he fell asleep sometime after midnight, still thinking about the corn. The tractors began arriving in Moline before sunrise, some of them having driven through the night from the further staging points in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and by 7:30 in the morning there were 38 machines parked on the street outside John Deere's regional office, and by 8:45 there were 63, and the sight of them, 63 John Deere tractors of various sizes and ages arranged in patient, silent rows on East Moline Boulevard in the early morning light, was something that the employees arriving for work that Friday morning had not expected to see and stood looking at with expressions that moved between confusion and recognition and something that might have been guilt or might have been fear, depending on the individual and their proximity to the decisions that had produced the situation they were looking at. And one of the arriving employees took a photograph from the parking lot entrance and posted it online at 8:52 in the morning, and that photograph was shared 40,000 times before 9:30 and was on the website of the Des Moines Register by 10 and on the Associated Press wire by 10:45 and on the national news by noon. Not because 63 tractors is an inherently dramatic number, but because the image those 63 tractors produced, green and yellow machines built by the company whose building they were parked outside, silent and patient and completely peaceful, was the kind of image that communicates something more efficiently than any argument, that says everything about power and proportion and the specific dignity of working people who have been treated as less important than a software licensing agreement and have decided to make their presence felt in the only language that requires no translation, which is the language of showing up, of being physically present in a place that was designed to make you feel absent, of parking your machine outside the building and waiting with the same patience you bring to a field that needs working, steady and unhurried and absolutely immovable. The first person to come out of the building was not an executive and not a lawyer and not a public relations representative, but a young woman named Sarah Chen who worked in John Deere's regional customer service department and who had seen the photograph her colleague posted from the parking lot and had walked to the front windows and looked at the 63 tractors on East Moline Boulevard and had made a personal decision that her job description did not require and her supervisor had not authorized, which was to walk outside and talk to the farmers, not as a company representative and not with prepared language, but simply as a person who had spent 3 years handling customer service calls from farmers, describing situations exactly like the one that had produced the image she had just seen from the window. And she walked out the front door at 9:15 in the morning with her employee badge still clipped to her jacket and no script in her hand, and found Dale Harmon standing beside Tom Briggs near the front row of tractors, identifiable because Curtis Webb had posted his photograph in the Convoy group chat the previous evening so that people would know who they were there for. And Sarah Chen walked up to Dale and said, "Mr. Harmon, I want you to know that I have read your file, and I understand what happened, and I am sorry." And Dale looked at her badge and said, "Are you authorized to say that?" And Sarah Chen said, "Probably not, but I'm saying it anyway." And Dale nodded and said, "I appreciate that." And they stood together for a moment looking at the tractors. And Sarah Chen said, "How much corn do you have standing?" And Dale said, "About 240 acres still unharvested." And Sarah Chen said, "What's your weather window?" And Dale said, 4 days, maybe." And Sarah Chen said, "I'm going to go back inside and make some calls." And Dale said, "All right." And Sarah Chen went back inside, and Dale stood with Tom in the morning light and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and both of them knew it. What was happening inside the building while Sarah Chen was making her calls was a compressed version of the kind of institutional reckoning that large organizations experience when the gap between their internal understanding of their own behavior and the external world's understanding of that same behavior becomes suddenly and publicly visible. A reckoning that John Deere's regional leadership had not anticipated on Thursday evening when they left the office, and had not been prepared for on Friday morning when they arrived to find 63 of their own machines parked outside their building in silent rows. And the reckoning had the particular quality of urgency that arrives when a situation has already escaped the stage where it could have been managed quietly, and has entered the stage where every hour of inaction produces more damage than the action itself would have cost. And the people in the building who understood this were arguing with the people in the building who were still trying to assess the legal exposure before authorizing any response. And the argument was being conducted across phone lines to Deere and Company headquarters in nearby Moline with a speed and intensity that the regional office's phone system had not been asked to sustain in recent memory. Dale's manila folder entered the situation at 10:40 in the morning, not through any dramatic presentation, but through Tom Briggs, who had spent the previous evening scanning every document in the folder onto his phone, and who had sent the complete digital file to a Farm Bureau attorney named Margaret Holloway in Des Moines at Rachel Harmon's insistence. And Margaret Holloway had reviewed the file Thursday night and had called Tom at 7 in the morning to say that what the file contained was not just Dale Harmon's personal complaint, but a documented record of systemic service failures spanning 3 years and covering 14 separate interactions with John Deere's authorized dealer network. Failures that included service delays averaging 47 days during planting and harvest windows, repair estimates averaging 3.4 times the independent shop rate for identical repairs, and 2 previous instances where Dale had been told that warranty coverage did not apply to repairs he subsequently had performed by independent technicians who identified the failures as clearly warranty eligible. And Margaret Holloway had said, "Tom, this folder is not a customer complaint. This is the foundation of a class action." And Tom had looked at Dale over his coffee cup and said, "Rachel was right about the lawyer." And Dale had said, "Rachel is usually right." And Tom had sent Margaret Holloway's assessment to Curtis Webb, who had posted it in the Convoy group chat at 7:45, and the 890 members of that chat had read it with the focused attention of people who have just discovered that their personal grievance has a legal architecture and a name and a path forward that extends beyond 63 tractors on a boulevard in Moline. By 11 in the morning, three things were happening simultaneously that John Deere's regional leadership had not planned for and could not individually control. The first being that the photograph of the 63 tractors was now on every major news website and had been picked up by the Associated Press and was generating interview requests from television stations in Chicago and Des Moines and Minneapolis. The second being that Margaret Holloway had filed a formal legal notice with Deere and Company headquarters, citing Dale's documentation as the basis for a potential class action on behalf of farmers who had experienced similar service failures. And the third being that a United States Senator from Iowa named Patricia Dolan, who sat on the Senate Agriculture Committee, had posted on Twitter that she was aware of the situation in Moline and was calling on John Deere to immediately restore Mr. Harmon's equipment functionality and to meet with her office to discuss the broader policy implications of remote equipment lockout capabilities. And the convergence of those three things at 11 in the morning on a Friday in September produced inside John Deere's regional building the specific institutional stillness that precedes a decision that has become inevitable, the stillness of an organization that has run out of the thing it was relying on to avoid the decision, which was time. And Dale Harmon standing outside with his folder and his neighbor and his 4 days of weather was the reason time had run out. The call came at 12:47 in the afternoon, and it came not to Dale's phone but to Margaret Holloway's phone in Des Moines, and Margaret called Tom immediately afterward, and Tom walked over to where Dale was standing near the front row of tractors eating a sandwich that Curtis Wedd's wife had brought in a cooler from their farm outside Des Moines. And Tom said, "Margaret got a call." And Dale said, "From who?" And Tom said, "From John Deere's general counsel's office in Moline." And Dale stopped eating and looked at Tom and said, "What did they say?" And Tom said, "They want to meet, today, here, this afternoon." And Dale looked at the 63 tractors and the farmers standing among them in the September light, men and women who had driven through the night from Wisconsin and Minnesota and Missouri, who had loaded machines onto flatbeds and arranged childcare and left their own farms on a Friday during harvest season because a farmer they had never met had posted a 7-minute video from a cornfield, and the video had said something true about something they all knew was true and had never been said publicly with documentation attached. And Dale said, "Tell Margaret yes." And Tom called Margaret, and Margaret called John Deere's general counsel's office, and the meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon in a conference room on the second floor of the regional building. And Dale finished his sandwich and looked at his phone, which showed the video at 1.4 million views, and put the phone in his pocket and straightened his jacket and walked inside with Tom and Margaret Holloway, who had driven from Des Moines that morning and arrived at 11:45 with a printed copy of Dale's folder under her arm and the focused expression of an attorney who has reviewed the documentation and knows exactly where she stands. The men on the other side of the conference room table were 3 in number: John Deere's regional vice president, whose name was Stephen Hartley, and who had the careful composure of a man performing composure rather than feeling it; a senior attorney named David Park from the company's legal department, who had driven from headquarters that morning and who said very little during the first 20 minutes of the meeting, but listened with the specific attention of someone cataloging everything for future reference; and a customer relations director named Brian Moss, who had been given the task of finding a path through the meeting that allowed the company to move forward without conceding more than the situation absolutely required. And on Dale's side of the table were Dale and Tom and Margaret Holloway, and a quietness that Margaret had advised on the drive from the parking lot. She had said, "Let me speak first. Let me establish what the documentation shows, and then, Dale, if they ask you a direct question, you answer it directly and completely and without anger. Anger is the one thing that helps them and hurts us today." Margaret opened by placing Dale's complete documented file on the table in a stack that was visible and deliberate, and said, "Gentlemen, my client has 3 years of documented interactions with your authorized service network that establish a pattern of service delays, excessive pricing, and warranty denial that I believe any reasonable jury would find relevant to the question of whether the remote lockout applied to his equipment on September 14th was a legitimate enforcement action or a punitive application of software capability against a customer who had sought independent repair because your authorized network had failed to provide timely service on 14 separate occasions over 3 years." And she slid a summary document across the table to each of the three men and said, "The average wait time for service during planting and harvest windows documented in this file is 47 days, and the average cost differential between your authorized dealer estimates and independent repair shop invoices for identical repairs is 3.4 times. And on 2 occasions, your dealer network denied warranty coverage for repairs that independent technicians subsequently identified as warranty eligible. And I want you to understand before this conversation proceeds that this file does not represent my client's grievance alone, but is representative of a pattern that I am currently in communication with more than 200 farmers about." And David Park looked at the file and looked at Margaret and said nothing, and wrote something on the notepad in front of him. And the room was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of quiet that exists when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present is adjusting to the new shape of the situation. Stephen Hartley spoke for 20 minutes, carefully and with the measured language of a man who has been briefed by lawyers before entering a room, acknowledging that the service experience Dale had described represented a failure to meet the company's own customer service standards, acknowledging that the remote lockout capability was a tool that required careful application and that its application in Dale's specific circumstances would be reviewed internally, acknowledging that the company valued its relationships with independent farmers and understood that those relationships had been strained. And Dale sat across the table listening to all of it with the patience of a man who has spent his life listening to weather forecasts and commodity prices and the various ways the world explains why things are the way they are. And when Stephen Hartley finished, Dale said, "Mr. Hartley, I have 240 acres of corn standing in my field, and 4 days of weather, and a combine that your system stopped on a clear morning when the crop was ready. When can I get back in my field?" And the directness of the question, after 20 minutes of careful language, produced a silence that Stephen Hartley filled by looking at Brian Moss, and Brian Moss looking at David Park, and David Park looking at his notepad, and then Stephen Hartley said, "Mr. Harmon, your equipment restriction will be lifted before end of business today." And Dale said, "Today?" And Stephen Hartley said, "Today." And Dale nodded and said, "Thank you." And that was the only thing he said in the meeting that was not an answer to a direct question, because it was the only thing left that needed saying. The restriction was lifted at 4:17 in the afternoon, confirmed by a text message to Dale's phone from the John Deere customer service system, and Dale was in his combine by 7 the next morning, with the header running and the yield monitor climbing and the standing corn moving through the machine in the steady rhythm of a harvest that had been interrupted for 3 days and was now finishing what it had started. And the weather held for 4 more days, which was 1 day longer than the forecast had promised, long enough for Dale to finish his 400 acres and pull the combine into the shed and sit on the porch in the October evening and look at the harvested fields and feel the completion that a finished harvest produces in a farmer regardless of what surrounded that harvest, a completion that exists independent of everything except the work itself and the ground that received it. The class action that Margaret Holloway filed 6 weeks later on behalf of 214 farmers across 11 states was a separate thing from Dale's combine and Dale's corn and the 63 tractors that had stood on East Moline Boulevard for one September Friday, but it grew directly from the documentation in the manila folder that Dale's father had taught him to keep and that Tom Briggs had recognized on a Wednesday night as the thing that made everything else possible. And the settlement that John Deere reached 18 months later included a commitment to limit the application of remote lockout capabilities and to establish an emergency service protocol for farmers experiencing equipment failures during planting and harvest windows, changes that the company's press release described as a proactive enhancement of customer service standards and that 214 farmers and their attorneys described differently but accepted as the practical outcome of a situation that had begun with a 7-minute video posted from a cornfield on a clear September morning when the corn was ready and the weather was good and a farmer had sat in a stopped machine and decided that the one thing he could not do was stay silent about it, And the 63 tractors that had stood outside the building had not won the argument alone, had never been the argument alone, had been the visible expression of an invisible foundation built from 3 years of documented phone calls and service invoices and repair estimates kept in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet by a man whose father had taught him that the details you write down are the only details that survive a dispute. And that lesson, older than John Deere and older than software licensing agreements and older than remote lockout capabilities embedded in $380,000 machines, was the thing that had unlocked the combine, not the tractors on the boulevard, not the news coverage, not the senator's tweet. Just the patient and unglamorous habit of a farmer who wrote things down and kept what he wrote and trusted that the truth documented carefully enough would eventually be more powerful than any system designed to make him feel that the machine he had paid for was not entirely his.